welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly series where I read through the letters to the editor in my local newspaper, The West Australian, and I criticise the stupid people who write in stupid things. First up, Pay for Your Children, 24th of July 2014. If people are too sick, too disabled or too old to work, they deserve some form of government assistance. But if people choose to have a child, it is their choice. Why do subsequent governments pay them to enjoy their chosen lifestyle? If you can't support your own choices, make different choices. Bev Emmingham, Warnbro. That's great, except for all those people who did not necessarily choose to have a child but have one anyway. All those people who chose to have a child but didn't actually understand what their choice was involved. And the fact that once you've chosen to have a child, you cannot then make a different choice. I guess in some small, technically you probably can, but for most people, once you have a child, you are stuck with that child. And so the idea that if you can't support your own choices, you should make a different choice, doesn't really apply very well to the case of children. Secondly, regardless of the foolishness of the choice of the parent, the main reason why the government invests in children is for the care of that child. So even if the parent has made a stupid choice, there is something to be said for supporting them just simply for the benefit of their child. Their child did not choose to be born, as every teenager knows, and therefore they could well do with some support. Now, there's a further argument, and actually the main reason why governments pay money to parents is because the government, as a reflection of society as a whole, does have a vested interest in children being raised in happy and healthy households, gaining an education and growing up to be fit and productive members of society. And so most of the payment that is made to parents on behalf of children is done so on the basis that this should flow to the child, or at least should indirectly benefit the child by producing a happier and or healthier home life. I would be completely happy to have a discussion about whether the specific payments and the amounts that are being done at the moment are reasonable, but the idea that the government has no vested interest and therefore shouldn't pay people who have children is rubbish. Just completely rubbish. We all have a vested interest in the children of this community and our society, just as we have a vested interest in our society as a whole being as happy and healthy and productive as possible. The Child Carer, 25th of July 2014. It's ridiculous that grandparents should have to take a TAFE course to get payment for childcare. We all know what's needed: a bag of lollies, box of DVDs, hard hat, high-vis fluoro vest and steel toe-cap boots. Reese Winterburn, City Beach. Now, I'm not sure whether this is tongue-in-cheek or not, but there were a bunch of letters. So what this is in reference to is our federal government has decided that they are, well, at least they're looking into the idea of paying grandparents and other extended family members of the extended family for their caring of their grandchildren or children. So you, as a grandparent, or as perhaps even an auntie or uncle, say, might be able to receive a government payment for looking after the young children in your family. This was, I think, floated as part of a way of addressing the high demand for childcare places. At the moment, it's quite hard to get your children into daycare or childcare, and it costs a fair bit as a result. And the government is subsidising this to a large amount as a way of trying to boost people's productivity so that people can go back to work. And it seemed like a reasonable idea to pay grandparents, say, to encourage them to look after their children in their house, in their sort of extended family. But what the government has said, that if they're going to start doing that it won't be simply a matter of, you look after the child and we give you some money. They will expect you to have done I'm not quite sure what the qualification is, but a relatively low-level training course, so that you have some understanding of what is expected of you as a carer to a small child. Now, and of course, this sparked off a whole pile of cries from grandparents saying, well, this is stupid, why should we do a course, etc., etc. Well, here's the thing. Most people acknowledge that being a parent is difficult, and most people acknowledge that there is no instruction manual for parenting. And I think most people in their sober moments of reflection would acknowledge that not all grandparents are equal, and certainly not all parents are equal. And simply having had kids does not make you an adequate carer or parent. Simply the ability to reproduce doesn't make you somebody who is particularly good at caring for. And if the government's going to throw some money around, given the high standards required of people who work in a childcare sector, it only seems reasonable if they're going to throw some of that money towards grandparents that you would have at least some minimal expectation that they would have some idea about what modern parenting expectations are. In particular, there would be a fair number of people who raised their own children 30 or 40 years ago, possibly in other countries or in other cultures where there are very different standards and expectations about the way that is appropriate to behave with a child. And so on some level, if the government is going to throw money, then they have some responsibility to ensure that money is not going to people who do a terrible job of parenting or even a poor job. And so I think some kind of basic standard, and this is not saying that you need to have this standard or do this course in order to become, a reasonable grandparent. It's just saying that if you want the money from the government, then you might have to do this course, whatever this course happens to be. Look at rational suicide, 25th of July 2014. The medical board has suspended the registration of Dr. Philip Nitschke to protect public health and safety. His support for what he called the rational suicide of a non-terminally ill patient has revealed the truth about euthanasia. They have no intention of limiting euthanasia to the terminally ill. The media, politicians and the public have not been told the truth. With 18 failed state euthanasia bills, politicians are even less likely to trust Dr. Nitschke after the medical board's decisive action. Dr. John Hayes, Woodlands. Okay, so if people are less likely to trust Dr. Nitschke and you, as you seem to be, are against euthanasia, then that would seem to be a good thing for you at least. So what happened here was so Dr. Nitschke is fairly well known as is one of the few doctors, I think he may have been the first doctor in the world to have actually performed a legal euthanasia on somebody, and he's a pro-euthanasia campaigner. His group that he is part of, called Exit International, have standards that basically say that in order to access their support, you pretty much have to be, I think, over the age of 50 and be terminally ill. It transpired that a person contacted him and clearly represented themselves as being 45 and not terminally ill. And Dr. Nitschke corresponded with this guy. There was no suggestion that he did anything other than correspond. Certainly didn't, encourage him to commit suicide or anything like that. Just, I think discuss some of the issues with him. I'm not quite sure what the claim was. This guy then illegally imported a drug, which, I think he got the information off the internet about where to get it from, and etc., and committed suicide. And so in the wash-up of this, it turned out that basically it's been claimed that Nitschke didn't actively encourage him to get psychiatric help. Because in Nitschke's, what Nitschke was saying was that he did not appear depressed. This person seemed to be of a sound mind and body and was actively researching ways to kill himself, and therefore, it didn't seem to him as a non-psychiatrist or psychologist a case of somebody who seemed obviously depressed. Now, I think Dr. Nitschke obviously doesn't really understand the psychiatric or the psychological issues at hand here to simply say that somebody seemed rational or didn't seem depressed. But Dr. Nitschke, since at least 2009, has been advocating essentially that the right to die should be a sort of seen as a human right for all people, not just the old and terminally ill. He's been fairly open about this. Now, his main campaign, like most people who are pro-euthanasia, the main campaign focuses on that group, which almost everybody, 85% of the Australian public agree, should have some right to die in a manner of their choosing. That is the particularly old and terminally ill, people who are suffering, and for whom palliative care is not, the panacea. The people who are in that situation, 85% of the Australian public apparently agree that these people should have some right towards being able to choose to die in the manner of their choosing with the people that they love around them. And that's where the campaign's been focused. But I don't think because the focus has all been on that, I guess you'd be forgiven for thinking that that's what Dr. Nitschke believed. Only these people should have that right. But he has been fairly clear in his position since at least 2009, and I'd agree with him broadly, that actually that right shouldn't be restricted to simply the old and the infirm. That anybody of sound mind should have the right to rationally choose to end their life. In Australian law, you might say it's pragmatic reasons, and probably it is, but there is no legal... there is no crime of committing suicide. Legally, you have every right to commit suicide. The only problem is that nobody's allowed to help you. Assisting a suicide is still criminal in most jurisdictions in Australia, all actually. And that's where the grey area is, so that people who do commit suicide, even if they're of sound mind, even if it's a completely rational choice that they make given their circumstances, aren't allowed to seek medical assistance for that, so as to do it painlessly. And so, like Dr. Nitschke, I mean, I would be happily advocating for the terminally ill and the old as a particular focus, but I also think that it should essentially be a human right. Now, I think there are grave issues there around determining whether somebody is of sound mind, and I think traditionally, or at least for the last little while, we have, as a society, essentially agreed that anybody who wants to end their life is almost by definition not of sound mind. And I think that's a reasonable precautionary approach to take. That as a matter of just practicality, that it almost certainly means anybody living in modern Australia, if you want to end your own life, you probably are not of sound mind. This guy, in this particular case, was interesting. His wife died in 2011, and he lost his job, which you may say is good grounds for him to go into depressed. But the actual thing that apparently seemed to trigger his depression was that there was a police investigation as to whether he had murdered his wife, and there were suggestions that I think 2 previous partners had also died in mysterious circumstances, or allegedly mysterious. And so there's this suggestion that he was possibly facing an investigation into his serial murdering of, I think 2, at least 2, and possibly 3 partners. And that it was that threat of jail time that perhaps had motivated him. And so the argument that some people were making, at least, was that this was a guy who simply realised that his, criminal spree was coming to an end, was facing the prospect of criminal prosecution and jail time, and therefore took a reasoned decision that he'd rather kill himself, die painlessly. Now, I don't know whether that's the actual facts of the matter, but there would be an argument that in that case it may actually have been rational. Somebody who'd been sentenced to life in jail, some people would say that it's quite rational to choose to kill yourself, that that's maybe the last act of control you have over your, the last freedom you have. And so I don't think that Dr. Nitschke is necessarily doing a bait and switch. I don't think many people in the sort of movement, as it were, is doing much of a bait and switch. I mean, they're focusing on that part which we can all agree on as a way of finding common cause, even though their personal views may be for a more broad definition of it. And I don't buy the slippery slope argument that if we did legalise one, we'd have to legalise all the others. I think each would be its own choice, and we could agree or disagree on them as we go. Cleansing a problem, 28th of July 2014. The pond life wallowing in its own detritus in Perth City car parks needs to be cleaned out. Car park begging racket, 26th of the 7th. While living in British Columbia many years ago, I witnessed that Vancouver City Council had a similar problem with vagrants occupying the steps of City Hall. The normal niceties to move them on were vociferously ignored, but the problem was easily solved by some direct action. At varying times during the day, and after 2 minutes warning, the concourse and steps were hosed down from high-pressure hydrants. Less than a week saw the problem solved. SJH Ray, Midland. Yes, if by problem you mean simply that these pond life, as you would call them, or vagrants, were shifted elsewhere, then yeah, problem solved. Not in my backyard. And this is essentially what we're seeing. So the background to this is that it had emerged recently that the multi-storey car parks within the central business district were playing host to a bunch of people who were begging, who were probably not legitimate in their begging, and there were some suggestions that they almost certainly were drug users, and it was certainly drug use. So the suggestion is that they're probably begging to pay for drug use rather than the hard luck story that they're presenting to the people passing by. And then there were suggestions also that there was some reports of them meeting with a person who was obviously not a beggar, and that he was exchanging things with them. So there's a suggestion that either they were doing it on this guy's behalf and it was some kind of organised racket, or, as I would think it's more likely, that this guy happened to be their dealer and was dealing them drugs, and they were paying in the takings from their begging. Anyway, on top of this also was because these people, the beggars were spending a lot of time in these car parks, and because basically as a way of discouraging drug use, as it were, in the central business district, there aren't really any public toilets available to people who look a bit vagranty. They were using the stairways and upper floors of the multi-storey car park as toilets, and it was rather filthy. So here we have a bunch of people who are, if not homeless, certainly drug using, almost certainly addicted to drugs, certainly not living a lifestyle that anybody necessarily would choose. So you would think that they were almost certainly addicted to drugs, probably homeless to some degree, possibly somewhat organised in their attempts. There was a suggestion that they spread out to the different car parks so that they weren't overlapping each other's territory, as it were, and that they were also perhaps notifying each other so that, when the security guards came to move them along, they would phone ahead to their mates so that they could move and not get caught, as it were. So there is suggestions that they're perhaps a little bit more organised than your typical just sort of drug user, but that might just be a matter of just looking after each other, or it might be that there's some kind of help from drug dealer mate, or maybe there's somebody who is orchestrating this, some kind of criminal mastermind, running the beggars. The reason why this is even an issue is because Perth basically doesn't have these problems. We have very few beggars, and we have relatively few visible homeless people. And that's actually partly, if I've looked at the stats, because the number of homeless people in Western Australia who literally don't have a roof over their head is actually very low. Most of our homeless people simply don't have a permanent dwelling of their own, but they, most of them live in other people's houses on a very temporary or insecure basis. And so we don't actually have this much of an issue. So when it came out that there were these people who were there, it, was absolute, people were outraged that this would happen. And so the suggestion is that you just close them down. Now the thing is, and good thing is that the city council are not taking this approach of simply getting rid of them. The only reason this is an issue is because they're in a central business district and relatively well-to-do people have to put up with seeing them. And to make it fair, there were some vulnerable people, sort of older people, who had been not exactly threatened, but certainly bullied into giving money to these beggars. And so there is legitimate concern over that. But the main reason it's an issue is because it happens to be in a central business district. And if we instituted the solution as, this Mr. S.J.H. Ray suggested, of somehow forcing them out using environmental measures, I noticed that in the UK, I think it was last year sometime, there was a place that put spikes out on the ground of their building to stop the homeless from lying down there. And most places have got benches that are specifically designed so you can't sleep on them. All this is going to do is push these people out further. We actually know that a lot of support service, it's easier to support a population of homeless people, that is to help them in terms of their health, to assist them to find housing, etc., etc. It is generally better if they are concentrated. In places like the CBD is good for them to be concentrated. That's usually where all the service providers are. If we force them out, they would have to go somewhere else. And one suspects that if they did end up in the less wealthy suburbs where us well-to-do people wouldn't have to see them, we wouldn't be particularly motivated to do anything about that, because it would just be the poor people who would be suffering from them then, and really who cares? And so I actually think we shouldn't be looking to move them on, as the City Council has determined as well, is that we actually should be looking at a more systemic solution to this problem, so as to prevent people from being in this situation in the first place, and instead of just shoving them out of sight, actually try and help them to find employment, housing, these kind of things, drug treatment. Lastly for this week, sickbeds before sport, 28th of July 2014. The new sports stadium looks fantastic, yet another splendid monument to the current government. I'd have a lot more respect for and trust in our representative body if that oh so necessary sports stadium were hospital beds and housing for the homeless. V. Curtis Kellebaran. I mean, I generally agree. I don't think new sports stadiums are particularly easy to justify at the best of times, and certainly not at a time of sort of fairly strong budgetary restraint. I don't, though. I never like the idea that. I never like this idea that, you know, we should spend it all on hospital beds, because no matter how many hospital beds you have, or actually housing for homeless would be a good idea, but no matter how much hospital beds you have, no matter how much you spend on education and health, people will always argue you should be spending more. And so I think that's a lazy argument. And the other thing is that I'm not sure, there's all these sort of numbers being thrown around, and there is a lot of money in this sports stadium. But part of the reason why they want to do that is because the old sports stadium was once built to be fairly, you know, outside of sort of, as a fairly suburban stadium. Now, decades later, is actually in a fairly central sort of inner suburban area, and the land value there is staggering. And so by building a new sports stadium in a place where there really aren't any residences there, the land there is cheap, that gives a whole pile of government land from the old stadium that can be knocked down and can be flogged off, and at the current property prices will make them an absolute packet. And so to borrow the money to build the new stadium so they can knock down the old stadium and sell off the land, plus you can then address some of the issues you have with the old stadium that's grown and is quite old and clunky, so that you can now... We've got stadium issues here. We don't have stadiums that are big enough or the right shape to play various sports. And Australians being Australians, there are lots of sports we want to play and in big stadiums. So the new stadium can address some of that. So it can run as a athletic stadium, as a oval sports stadium, and as a square pitch stadium, which means that all the major sports essentially can play there quite happily. So I actually think it's a bit of a winner. I think it's a lot of money, and I think, yes, the money could probably be better spent elsewhere, so I don't know whether the timing's great. But I don't like the lazy argument that, you know, no matter what you've got, no matter when you do it, whenever you spend money on a sports stadium, somebody's always going to come out and say, wow, you know, you should have spent that on hospitals and schools. Oh, that's it for this week. I'm feeling much better. Hope you're all doing well, and I'll see you next time for when we find out what's happening in the West. See you later.